It's Monday night. Apologies for initially sending around an essay which belongs to next week's Parashah, Parashat Vayera. It's a bonus. I'm not sure yet if we'll do that one next week or not. If we do a different one, I'll send that along. And this afternoon, we sent out the correct one for this evening for Parshat Lech Lecha. And in fact, I noticed that a few years ago when we were doing Rav Meidan on the weekly Parsha, for one reason or another, we did not learn together on the week of Parshat Lech Lecha, but the intended essay was actually an essay of Rav Meidan's, which is very parallel to this one. Not surprising, Rav Meidan is from the same broad Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati, Rav Yoel bin Nun, school of biblical commentaries that Rav Shalom is also a student of. And so there are certainly overlapping interpretive traditions. And I'll perhaps comment on at the end about where they diverge a little bit. And we'll see if we can actually send along an English translation of Rav Meidan's essay on this similar topic for your reading enjoyment before next week. But meanwhile, as we enter into Parshat Lech Lecha, we have this week's essay. It's called Abraham, the Early Years, Midrash as Parshanut. And we'll jump right in because there's a fairly lengthy introduction here in which Rav Shalom kind of lays out approaches to the study of Midrash, which I find very valuable, both because I enjoy Midrash on its own, and also because Rashi so frequently quotes Midrashim. Being able to kind of dig into what's really going on with a Midrash as a form of commentary, I think is a valuable endeavor, and that's what Rav Shalom is going to assist us in doing this week. So, Introduction Midrashic Literature, he writes, this chapter presents a vital key to understanding the methodology of Parshanut. Instead of introducing new tools of interpretation, right, we've already seen a few of those, thinking about the ears of the reader. This week's, which is really next week's, was about something we've seen in other commentaries as well, the Milah Mancha, the light vort. We saw it with Nechama Leibowitz. We saw it a little bit with Rabbi Shai Held. So instead of introducing new tools of interpretation, we will now discover that the rabbis of the Midrash use them as well. In other words, there are tools of interpretation that go all the way back to rabbinic interpretation of texts. That genre of rabbinic literature commonly known as Midrash has been widely misunderstood and has taken a proverbial beating in more than one circle of late. In order to properly assay the issue and begin our inquiry, we must first clarify and distinguish between two terms that are often confused in discussions of rabbinic homiletics. The term midrash, which means exegesis, a particular type of textual expansion and application, is properly used to describe any of a number of exegetical methods. Generally speaking, there are two types of midrash, midrash halacha and midrash agadah. Midrash halacha is an exegetical analysis of a legal text with a normative result, meaning a prescriptive legal result. For instance, when the Torah defines fit animals as being min ha-behema, the animals that are fit for sacrifice, as being min ha-behema, of the animals that you're going to bring an offering, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban Hashem, min ha-behema, when a person from amongst you will bring an offering to God from animals. The Midrash Halacha infers from that particular phrase that not all animals are fit to be brought to the altar, and then goes on to list which are excluded, right? And here we can just see part of why we call this exegesis is because it's drawing something out of the text which is not really explicit in the text. In the normal reading of the text, it would make sense to say if a person brings an offering from the animals or of the animals, but the Midrash, the Midrash Halacha, the exegetical midrash for legal normative purposes reads mean as meaning from, meaning that there is a subset of animals that can be brought as offerings. Because the results of a legal discussion are practical, the exegetical method is relatively tightly defined and is subject to challenge and dispute. In fact, in the morning when we just before Psukei de Zimra, when we say the Shlosha Esrei Midot She'atorah Nidreshet Bahen, the 13 hermeneutical principles. Those are generally talking about principles of midrash halacha, of normative, legal, exegetical interpretation. Um, Midrash Agadah, this right, so he had said originally, there's two types of Midrash, Midrash Halacha and Midrash Agadah, described Midrash Halacha as a more tightly defined exercise with a normative result. That's Midrash Halacha. Midrash Agadah can be loosely defined as any other sort of exegesis on biblical text. This includes exhortative, poetic, prophetic, narrative, epic, and any non-normative text in the Bible. As expected, the range of texts available for Midrash Agadah is much broader, and the methodology is less strictly defined than for Midrash Halacha. In addition, multiple approaches can be tolerated and even welcomed because there is generally no legal implication to the inference. Even in those cases where such an inference may be claimed, the general methodology of the study of Midrash Agadah allows, indeed encourages, a wider range of approaches and perspectives. As such, we may find a series of alternate Midrashei Agadah on a given passage, for example, the test of Abraham in Genesis 22:1, that although representing different perspectives, do not necessarily preclude one another. Right? There are different lists of the 10 tests of Abraham, and they don't have to agree with each other. Hence, the term halacha, when standing alone and describing a type of rabbinic statement, would most properly be associated with a normative statement independent of the text. The word agadah refers to a statement that is non-normative and again is not derived from or associated with a given text. The study of Midrash Agadah has always been challenging to identify which interpretations are exegetical as an attempt to discern the straightforward meaning of the text, meaning where Midrashei Agadah are trying to fill in a gap in the text and express what we think it's really saying, which are polemic, often against the early Christians, which are veiled attacks, for example, in the Roman Empire, which are traditional lore that the author of the homily is hanging on a particular text, meaning there might have just been ethic or a value or a lesson or a story that was, a folk story that was predominant in the period, and you give that more weight by making it an interpretation of an existing text and not the other way around. Not that you're really trying to understand that text better, but you're trying to ground something from outside the narrower canon of tradition by connecting it to something from the canon of tradition. Much of the derision shown by many towards statements in the Midrash Agadah, indicated by phrases such as, it's only a Midrash, is rooted in an inability or unwillingness to rigorously address the text and analyze its various components. Understanding that some are intended as literal interpretations and an actual retelling of history, whereas others are poetic and artistic devices intended to drive home a critical point. The Rambam, Maimonides, neatly divided the students of Agadah into three groups: those who take everything literally, who are fools; those who take nothing literally, who are heretics; and those who wisely analyze each passage and discern how each passage ought to be studied. Excuse me. Our goal is implied to be to fall into category number 3, where we're able to discern which midrashim are meant to be taken more literally and which less so. A proper and incisive approach to the study of Midrash Agadah, knowing which passage to approach with which perspective, consistently rewards the student with a discovery of depths of wisdom and profound sensitivity. There's been a considerable renewal of interest in Midrashic literature of late. In traditional circles, this was spurred on by Maharal, so we're going to the 17th century, and his systematic approach to Agadah, which suffused his many compilations. 19th and 20th century rabbinic figures such as Reb Chaim of Volozhin, the Netziv, and Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, among many, developed a repertoire of Agadic tools which they wove into their worldviews. In the academic world, Joseph Heinemann, Yonah Frankel, and Avigdor Shinan, that's close to our Bait. Professor Avigdor Shinan is the son-in-law of our late cherished Bait member Pesach Klein. All of Hebrew University have done much to promote the analytic study of Midrash. A proper presentation of the various facets of Midrash Agadah is well beyond the scope of this forum. However, that does not exempt us from, at the very least, re-examining our attitude toward this central branch of rabbinic literature and strengthening our awareness of the sagacity and trust of the rabbis that is, after all, one of the 48 methods through which Torah is acquired from Pirkei Avot. To that end, we will assay a famous Midrash Agadah, which is prima facie nearly bereft of midrashic method, whose point of origin is an oblique reference at the end of Genesis 11. The central thesis here is that there is, of course, much more to the Midrash Agadah than meets the eye. The fuller thesis will be presented after the following text. Okay, so again, whereas pretty much all the other essays will spend much more time in the Pshat, in the plain sense text of the Parashah, because of how important getting a grounding in what Midrash Agadah is all about and how it works is a worthwhile exercise, and because of understanding, or the hypothesis here, that the rabbis themselves were engaging in some classic interpretive methods when they made their Midrashay Agadah. It's worth taking a foray into a familiar one and sort of applying some of the tools of analysis to it. Yeah, Tati James?
If we do it wrong, meaning if we label the midrash in the wrong category, do we then fall into number one or category number one or number two?
um,
Is it a strict
that's
category for all midrashim, and if you get it wrong, you're either a heretic or a
right.
fool?
It's a fair question. It's hard to answer for the Rambam. He had a if we went by all of his classifications of who might be heretics or fools, we'd probably fail on other tests
It would
anyway.
definitely be both.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what he's saying is that as long as you fundamentally understand that, making mistakes on either side is not a big deal if you have a general orientation to recognizing that there are some that are not meant to be taken literally and there are others that are, and you might not get them all correct. That's my assumption. But it's a fair question, of course. Okay, the Midrash. As developed above in chapter 5, one of the central figures, not chapter 5 of the Torah, but chapter 5 of this book, one of the central figures, if not the pivotal one, in Bereshit and Genesis is Abraham. We're given rich descriptions of his interactions with kings, family members, angels, and God's self, several of which will occupy our attention in the next few chapters of this book. We won't get to see that much of, but all of that begins with his selection at age 75. We're told nothing in the text about his early life. The few vague verses at the end of chapter 11 help little, if at all, in explaining why this son of Terach, scion of Shem, was selected as the progenitor of God's people. There are several well-known Agadot that partially fill in the missing years of Abraham's youth. Perhaps the most well-known Agadah appears in several versions and has as its point of departure a minor difficulty in the Torah's retelling of Abraham's family life. So we're starting with something from the end of last week's Parashah, Parshat Noach, the generations of Terach. Terach lived 70 years and fathered Avram, Nahor, and Haran. These are the generations of Terach. Terach fathered Avram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. And Haran died before his father Terach in the land of his birth in Ur Kasdim. Avram and Nahor took wives. The name of Avram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Yiscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terach took Avram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Avram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. They came to Haran and lived there. And the days of Terach were 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. The death of Haran, not to be confused with the place Haran, located in northern Syria or southern Turkey, during the life, literally in the presence of his father, was a first, right? So he's referring back to after we hear that Terach has 3 sons, the first thing we hear, or almost the first thing we hear, is that Haran died in the presence of his father Terach, or upon the face of his father Terach, in the land of his birth in Ur Kasdim. This is before they depart from there. Haran already has a son, Lot, and dies. Although Hevel died before Adam, we're not given any information about the relationship between the bereaved father and his murdered child, right? So the death of Haran during the life of his father was a first in the sense of the juxtaposition of the two, not the first child to die in the life of a parent, but the first one whose death in the life of the parent is narrated as such. Here, the text clearly marks the death of Haran as happening before the death of Terach, the first recorded case of a child predeceasing his father, where we can actually place the two of them in any sort of relationship. The Midrash addresses this problem of the premature death of Haran, and along the way does much to inform us of Abraham's life before the command of Lech Lecha. Here's the text of the Midrash. Again, you may be familiar to in some version or another. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. Rabbi Chia, the grandson of Rabbi Ada of Yafa, or Yafo, said, Terach was an idolater. One day he went out somewhere and put Abraham in charge of selling the idols. When a man would come who wanted to purchase, Abraham would say to him, How old are you? The customer would answer, 50 or 60 years old. Abraham would say, Woe to the man who is 60 years old and desires to worship something one day old. The customer would be ashamed and leave. One day a woman came carrying in her hand a basket of fine flour. She said, Here, offer it before them. Abraham seized a stick and smashed all the idols and placed the stick in the hand of the biggest of them. When his father came, he said to him, meaning his father said to Abraham, Terach said to Abraham, Who did this to them? Abraham said, Would I hide anything from my father? A woman came carrying in her hand a basket of fine flour. She said, Here, offer it before them. When I offered it, one god said, I will eat first, and another said, No, I will eat first. Then the biggest of them rose up and smashed all the others. His father said, Are you making fun of me? Do they know anything? Abraham answered, Shall your ears not hear what your mouth is saying? He, Terach, took Abraham and handed him over to Nimrod. Nimrod said to him, Let us worship the fire. Abram said to him, If so, let us worship the water which extinguishes the fire. Nimrod said to him, Let us worship the water. Abram said to him, If so, let us worship the clouds which bear the water. Nimrod said to him, Let us worship the clouds. Abram said to him, If so, let us worship the wind which scatters the clouds. Nimrod said to him, Let us worship the wind. Abram said to him, If so, let us worship man who withstands the wind. Nimrod said to him, You are speaking nonsense. I only bow to the fire. I will throw you into it. Let the God to whom you bow come and save you from it. Haran was there. He said to himself, Either way, if Abraham is successful, I will say that I am with Abraham. If Nimrod is successful, I will say that I am with Nimrod. Once Abraham went into the furnace and was saved. They asked Haran, With which one are you allied? He said to them, I am with Abraham. They took him and threw him into the fire, and his bowels were burned out. He came out and died in front of Terach, his father. This is the meaning of the verse, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. Okay, so again, a familiar midrash in some form or another, perhaps to many of us. But you can see its richness and its kind of some of the details of its literary quality, really reading it through line by line. Rav Ezra one year on Shavuot night did a close study of this midrash, really, really delving into its beautiful, great depths. Reading this Haggadah, one is immediately struck by the non-midrashic style. There is absolutely no association with text here. Instead, there is a detailed story, down to the specifics of the debate between Abraham and Nimrod, the manner in which Abraham would shame his customers, and the story he concocted to explain the decimation of the inventory to his father. The question one must pose here is one of source. From where did the rabbis derive this information? How did they know that Terach was an idol salesman, that Abraham spoke this way to his customers, the other way to his father, and in such a manner to Nimrod? Why would we even think that Abraham and Nimrod ever met? Right? Typically in a midrash, it will bounce back and forth between, even in a midrash agadah, between text and interpretation, close readings, inferences, connections between different verses. Here we simply have the statement that Haran died on the face of his father Terach, and then this entire story to lead to that conclusion along the way we're fed tremendous amounts of information or narrative without recourse back to the text. The one answer that is always available is Masorah tradition. To wit, the rabbis had a reliable tradition going back to Abraham himself, that this is how this particular series of events played out. That is appealing, although anyone embracing this approach would have to contend with variations in alternate versions, right? We have different versions of the story. Yet there are two serious problems with this response. First of all, If this was a reliable tradition dating back to Abraham, why isn't it mentioned in the text of the Agadah? After all, when the rabbis have reliable traditions dating back to a much more recent time, they indicate this. Or, at the very least, refer to the statement as Gemara, meaning a learned tradition, or Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. Or in a Gadic context, they'll say this matter is a tradition in our hands, Masora hi biadenu, something like that. So, if this story really was handed down generation to generation from the people it happened to, why don't we have any indication of that? Second of all, why is the entire Agadah credited to one authority, Rabbi Chia, the grandson of Rabbi Ada of Yafo? Shouldn't he be presented as an anonymous text, right? If it's really a tradition which was handed down, it wouldn't necessarily have arrived in the hands or the name or the voice of one person. There is another direction, perhaps as much to the skeptical side as the first answer was to the believer side, that has its roots in some rabbinic scholarship, although certainly not the mainstream. Some will suggest that this Agadah reflects a polemic against idolatry. It's a product of its time in the sense that it stakes no claim to knowing anything about Abraham's actual activities, but uses Abraham as a convenient foil for making a point about principles, idols, loyalty, and so on. As stated, this is not as foreign an idea as one might think, and is sometimes the most appropriate way to view an Agadah, right? It's not, we have no way of knowing if it really happened this way, but it's a characteristic or didactic sort of story to prove a point. And so we don't have to take it literally, drawing from the Rambam's formulations, but we understand the truth value of its message. Unfortunately, this is often an easy way out of contending with the difficult question of how did they know this? In other words, once you say that, either answer really, once you say either this is just a tradition, or you say, this is not based in tradition, but it's a teaching of the rabbis to prove a point. You certainly lose out on the opportunity to analyze it and see if there are groundings in text that one might find, even if they're not made explicit. I would like to suggest an alternative approach to understanding this midrash, one that maintains the integrity of the report and its association to the historic character of Abraham, while defending against the two challenges raised to the Masorah argument noted above. Okay, here we go, the thesis. Although direct derivations are not found in this Agadah, albeit the opening and closing lines anchor the Agadah in a midrashic attempt to identify the reason for Haran's early demise, right? Meaning there is a jumping off point in the text. Haran died in the face of his father Terach. How do we know that? What's the backstory? Why did a child predecease a parent? So we know we have that jumping off point, that difficulty in the text, but all the rest of the narrative details are not grounded in any text explicitly. I'd like to suggest that the entire reconstruction of Abraham's life here is the result of parshanut, textual interpretation. In other words, every one of the major components of this selection is the result of a reasonable read of the Bible. This is not to argue that every detail of the Agadah is exegetically derived from the text, especially given the variations of those details as found in the versions of the passage. It is the suggested thesis here, however, that each general component of the Agadah is directly derived from a careful reading of the biblical text. In other words, to say this narrative, true or false, is plausible because it's grounded in stories, values, and facts that and texts that we can derive from our tradition, from the Torah. In order to accomplish this, each text in the Abraham narrative and other selections that shed light on this period must be read carefully, keeping an eye out for parallel texts and allusions to related passages. Indeed, the same reading between the lines, that's the name of this book, that is the raison d'etre of this book, was practiced by the rabbis of the Midrashic era. In other words, they were also close readers, and they noticed things that produced their supposition of a story like this to be plausible and told. There are 6 principal components to the Agadah. We will demonstrate that each of them can be supported by a sensitive and careful read of the Abrahamic narrative and related texts. A, Terach the idolater, B, Terach the salesman. C, Abraham's style of argumentation. D, Abraham's meeting with Nimrod. E, Abraham in the fire. F, Haran and Pascal's wager. And none of them are very long, So we'll make our way through them, and I think we'll find some of them more compelling than others, as we sometimes did in some of our other readings. But they add up to, I think, make a somewhat convincing case. The source, so A, Terach the idolater. The source for this component is an explicit text, Yoshua 24:2. At the end of his life, Joshua related a historiosophy to the people, which begins with this line from the Haggadah, from Joshua, quoted in the Haggadah. And Yoshua said to all the people, "Thus said the Lord God of Israel, your fathers lived on the other side of the river in old time. Terach, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods," right? This is adduced as the proof text to one of the narrative frameworks of the Haggadah, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu, that our ancestors began as idol worshippers, right? And this text is quoted, telling us that Terach, Abraham's father, was an idol worshipper. Even though this translation renders the last pronoun, they served other gods, unclear, such that we don't know who worshipped foreign gods. It may be Nahor and Avraham, which would give us a whole different story, right? Your fathers lived on the other side of the river in old time. Terach, the father of Avraham and Nahor, and they served other gods. Could be Avraham and Nahor, could be Terach and the ancestors that he was a part of. The cantillation marks, the Tameh HaMikra, make it clear that those who worshipped foreign gods are your fathers, because there's a sort of a hard pause after Avram and Nahor, and they worshipped idols, sends you back to the beginning of the verse. Terach is the representative of that group mentioned by name. When the Agadah begins by stating Terach was an idolater, it isn't innovating a new idea or revising history. This is the information found in Joshua's farewell address. Right now, we might even say to us, like, well, that's obvious. Abraham discovered God. His father must have been an idolater. But we're in that, I think we're somewhat influenced by this midrash. So we have to sort of unlearn that assumption. Say, I look at this midrash. On what basis do I know that Terach is an idolater? And then say, oh, well, we have a textual proof from Joshua. B, Terach the salesman. This one is not as straightforward and accessible as Terach's idolatrous affiliation, right? Meaning we know he's an idolater. How do we know he's an idol dealer? A few pieces of information about the ancient world that can be inferred from the text will help us. First, and this is really like just a pulling together of some threads which could produce a different outcome, but here's what Rav Shalom wants to argue. Society in the ancient world was not transient. People stayed in one area for generations, except for cases of war or famine, which is why the call to Abraham of Lech Lecha, of go, is so extravagant and reckoned by rabbinic tradition as the first of his tests, because people stayed put. Only people whose livelihood allowed them to move easily did so. And as the text tells us, Terach took his family from Ur towards Canaan, getting only as far as Haran, right? And we don't know that he got any explicit command to do so. So he was just somehow naturally moving. Terach was the first person who we are told uprooted from one location to another without direct divine intervention, such as Adam, Cain, and the people in Shinar who were exiled, right? There were reasons they were driven out, they were forced out, etc. Terach, there's no famine that we're told about, there's no war that we're told about. He just takes his family and moves. Hence, big hence here, he must have had a profession that allowed him to easily move, which leaves him either as a shepherd, an artisan, or a salesman. A careful look at the Genesis narratives will show that Abraham and Yaakov were traders whose chief livelihoods and fortunes were made in that fashion. The use of camels owned by both, and their possession and use of precious metals, gold and silver, are clear indications of mercantile behavior. In addition, we have other records of idolaters who were, in addition to devotees of the pagan religion, men who engaged in the sale of ritual objects. In Judges 17 to 18, we're told the story of Micha, who lived on Mount Ephraim. He took money given to him by his mother and had an idol fashioned, which he then set up in a temple. When his idol, its appurtenances, and his priest were seized by members of Dan, the townspeople chased after the thieves to try to restore their goods. Although not stated explicitly, it seems that the reason for their distress at the loss of the idol and its support system was an issue of livelihood. Evidently, the temple was a source of revenue for the town, whether as a result of travelers staying there or because they sold trafim, household gods. In any case, the association between idolatry and trade seems clear. So again, not a not a one-to-one correspondence, but pointing out some background information and context about why people might move and about particularly the family of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov that gives plausibility to the idea that Terach was not just an idolater, but may have been a salesman of idols. Avram's style of argumentation. Again, these are severable. You could accept one argument and not accept the other, and still see multiple groundings for this midrash. At 3 points in the Agadah, Avraham engages in some form of theological debate or rebuke, with the usual customer, with his father, and with Nimrod. His style of arguing is consistent. At no point does he come out and state his beliefs, strong though they may be. Instead, he elicits information from his disputant, and then in classical Socratic fashion, turns that person's own words against him, using the disputant's premise to bolster his own argument. For instance, he doesn't ridicule or rebuke the customer for purchasing a god fresh from the kiln. Rather, he asks him seemingly offhandedly as to his age. One almost gets the sense that Avram's response is muttered under his breath. How ridiculous! A man of 50 worshipping a day-old idol. In shame, the customer slinks out of the shop. That we have every reason to believe that Avraham would have worked to promote the belief in one God is evident from the verses that highlight his selection and his activities in Canaan, calling out in the name of God, right? Multiple places it says Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, calling out in the name of God. We don't need to look far to find sources that support the content of his interactions. But how do the authors of this Midrash Agadah know his somewhat unconventional form of argumentation? I saw what James wrote in about the people of Shinar arriving in that valley seemingly of their own accord. Yes, that's a fascinating point, great point, and I have no immediate answer. It's a good pushback on this being the first instance of unmotivated moving. So we'll have to look more into that. Great question. Thank you. Okay, how do the authors of this Midrash Agadah know his somewhat unconventional form of argumentation? The answer can be found, I believe, in the interaction between Avram and Avimelech, chapter 20, meaning later, in which we're going to learn something about Avram and apply it back to telling this story about his childhood. Unlike the first wife-sister episode in Egypt, which was necessitated by the famine, there is no reason given for Avram's descent to Gerar. Avraham knew in advance that he would have to utilize the wife-sister ruse in order to spare his life. But why go there at all? Note that in that interaction, Avraham does not rebuke the king and indirectly his constituents for their moral turpitude until they come to him, ready to hear an explanation for his curious behavior. If he went to Gerar in order to spread the word and attract more adherents, and he cites a Rashi and Sforno that might suggest that that was part of Avram's motivating actions, why in general, why didn't he immediately come in and decry their low standards? Alternatively, if he knew that Sarah would be endangered as a result, why go there at all? It seems, and again, a big it seems, but really worth considering, that Abraham went there in order to engage in debate, a debate that could only begin once the people challenged him and were receptive, as a result of their great fear, to what he had to say. It seems to have succeeded at least partially, because Avimelech or his son recognized God's support for Yitzchak, implying that they had some understanding of and respect for the God of Abraham. Utilizing the one instance we have of argumentation and chastisement in which Abraham participated that is explicit in the text, the authors of the Midrash are able to apply that style to earlier interactions in Abraham's life. I would add, he doesn't cite it, but certainly it seems like Abraham's kind of style of engagement with God, even about the destruction of Sodom, questions that are not accusations or attacks, but rhetorical questions and non-rhetorical questions, sort of falls in this broader category of style. The claim
What's
here
interesting?
is
What's
not.
interesting is the one of Abraham's arguments to his father was, "Shall I hide anything from you?" It's like "Hamechaseni me
Yes,
Abraham."
yes, exactly. I noticed that also. I didn't check the Hebrew to see if it's the exact same language, but it certainly sounds like it. Ira very sharply, thank you, is pointing out that back in the Agadah, where Avram says,
He says to his father,
would I hide anything from my father? right? It's the same, in the English at least, it sounds like the same language as when God decides to tell Abraham about the fate of Sodom. God says, would I hide anything from Abraham that I'm going to do? I noticed it also and thought there must be a subtle link there. I'll have to check the Hebrew original to see if they're the same language. But yeah, I think that's a literary kind of play as well. Okay, just concluding part C now. The claim here is not that each of the specific events or the details, such as the age of the customers, can be inferred from the text, nor that we need to accept each of them as an exact historic record. The thesis is merely that the general information and messages of the Agadah are the result of a careful reading of the text, right? That in shaping the story of Abraham in this, encounter, purported or real, it's meant to be, lifelike, what we could call historical fiction or something like that. Avram's meeting with Nimrod. The Torah is not only silent about any meeting between these two, the entire Nimrod biography is completed well before Abraham is even introduced in the text. From where did the Midrashic authors get the notion that Nimrod and Abraham had any direct interaction? One feature shared by these two men is power. Both were recognized as kings. Indeed, Nimrod was the first person to be considered a king. Genesis chapter 10, Cush fathered Nimrod. This is the end of last week's Parashah. He was the first on earth to be a mighty one. Gibor Chayil. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, meaning he became a sort of a paradigm or an archetype. And the beginning of his kingdom, Reshit Mamlachto, was Bavel and Erech and Akkad and Kalneh in the land of Shinar, right? So that's the beginning of his kingdom. Then Nimrod was some sort of a king, ruler, emperor. Avram is also considered royalty. Later on in Chayei Sarah, when he purchases a burial plot for Sarah, the Hittites answer Abraham and say to him, Shema'enu Adoni, Nasi Elohim ata b'kirbeinu. Hear us, my Lord, you are a mighty prince among us. There is one more component. Well, we'll let him develop his argument. There's one more component to the Nimrod story that is vital for understanding the Agadah. The attitude of the Bible is generally negative towards human rulers. Note Gidon's response to the people of Manasseh in Judges 8, and Shmuel's diatribe against the people's demand for a king in Shmuel Aleph, chapter 8. Nimrod being the first self-declared king, he was also the first to form a direct challenge to the rule of the one true king. Abraham's entire life was dedicated to teaching the world about the one true God and to encouraging everyone to accept God's rule. As such, Abraham and Nimrod are natural combatants and antagonists. Since Nimrod's life overlapped that of Abraham, and he ruled in the district where Abraham operated, at least during part of his younger years, the land of the Chaldeans, it is most reasonable that the two of them would have interacted. Once we add in the salvation from fire, see next section, following the model of the latter-day king of the same area, Nebuchadnezzar, throwing loyal monotheists into the fire, their meeting is almost a foregone conclusion. Okay, a little strong, almost a foregone conclusion, but certainly, if we accept the characterizations of Nimrod as the first king and Abraham as seen as some kind of regional leader, and and whose job it was to promote God as the true king, then we could certainly understand, a plausibility of their having met, even though the Torah doesn't tell us about any such encounter. And here, in this last little line about, following the model of the latter-day king of the same area, Nebuchadnezzar, we get what's one of the two central points in Rav Meidan's essay on the basis of this midrash. He opens up his essay making the same point. I think I can just quickly pull up the English translation. Rav Meidan's essay, Lech Lecha, the beginning of Avram's journey, he quotes the midrash, and then he says something very similar, of course, to Rav Et Shalom. He says, the two Agadot cited above have no support. He sort of divides it into two: the idol worships, idol store story and the fiery furnace story. And he says the two Agadot cited above have no support in the verses themselves. From where then do Chazal draw the details of these two incidents? And he cites a story about destroying a father's idol, or a father's sacrifice, which is told to Gidon. And then in the book of Judges. And then for part two, he tells the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the casting of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah into the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel. And then he has a different task, which is to try to argue why do we think, these stories would have formed the basis for the Abraham story, right? So what's different between these two is whereas Rav Echelom is trying to read into the Abraham story to find, the plausibility and the details in the Abraham narrative that would make this Agadah come to life and be written the way it was. Rav Meidan sort of says, what are the biblical stories that model the kind of values or conflicts that are at play here with the same, narrative content, and what would have made the rabbis then choose to apply them to the Avraham story to then craft this midrash. So they're getting at the same thing from different angles, and their really only point of overlap is this little moment. Next, Avram in the fire. And we'll see, instead of drawing on the Nebuchadnezzar story from the book of Daniel, he has a really, I think, creative and clever reading here. When God addresses Avram in anticipation of the first covenant between the parts in chapter 15, God states, I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur Kasdim. Before assessing the allusion to a later verse, we need to clarify the meaning of Ur Kasdim. The word Ur may be a place name, hence Ur of the Chaldees in most translations. Alternatively, it may mean the Ur that is in the Chaldean land. The word Ur meaning furnace, with references to a couple places where it seems that way in Yeshayahu. Even if it is a place name, it may have been named after a great furnace found there. In any case, God took Abraham out of this place, right? The Lord who took you out of Ur Kasdim. How do we understand the verb hotzeticha, I took you out? Does it refer to the command to get you out of your land, Lech Lecha me'artzecha? Does it allude perhaps to a more direct and interventionist evacuation? The only other place in the Torah where Asher Hotzeti, that whom I took out or that I took you out, appears is in the first statement of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. In that case, the taking out was accomplished through miraculous interventionist means. If we accept the theory, which we have explained and utilized in this volume, that unspecified terms in the canon are best clarified through parallel passages in the Bible where those same terms are used, then we have a clearer picture of the exodus of Abraham from Mesopotamia. God intervened miraculously to save him in some manner that would later be approximated in Egypt. Although we have a great deal of information about the miracles leading up to the Exodus, there is little in the Bible to describe the servitude from which we were redeemed. There is, however, one description of the Egyptian sojourn that appears in 3 passages. In Deuteronomy 4:20, in Malachim Aleph chapter 8, and in Jeremiah 11, the Egypt from which we were redeemed is called an iron furnace, Kor HaBarzel. So, if God presents God's self, as it were, to Abraham with the words that took you out, and we have no information as to what it was from which Abraham was saved, we can look at the parallel passage and, using the description of Egypt found throughout the canon, conclude that Abraham was saved from a furnace. Again, we're piecing pieces here together, but they, this is a little bit of a far-fetched metaphor, but it's like, the Ken or Sudoku puzzles where you have some set of numbers already filled into the grid and you have to fill in the rest of them. And, they are set up to have only one solution, but I'm imagining one where there could be multiple solutions. There's enough blank spaces in this argument that you could construct another solution, but there is a solution that can be constructed connecting these fixed data points, right? There's an exclusive identification between I took you out of Ur Kasdim and I took you out of Egypt. Egypt is described as a furnace. Ur Kasdim, the word or could mean furnace. One was a miraculous intervention, and therefore we can piece together a compelling argument that Avram's going forth included being miraculously saved from a furnace. Okay, finally, Haran and Pascal's wager. The final point in the Midrash that we will address is the role of Haran here. He engages in what is commonly referred to as Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician and logician, suggested that it is a good idea to believe in God based on the odds. If one doesn't believe in God and turns out to have erred, he will be eternally damned. If he is right, he will achieve salvation. If, on the other hand, he believes in God and turns out to have erred, he will have lost nothing. Haran's faith, unlike that of Abraham, is depicted as opportunistic. The point of this segment of the Agadah is quite clear. Declarations of faith are not cut from one cloth, and the faith that can withstand the furnace is one that has already been forged by the crucible, not one of momentary convenience. How did the authors of the Midrash know that this was Haran's failing? Why couldn't he have predeceased his father for some other sin? Again, we are not looking for a clue to help determine the exact wording used by Haran in his response to Nimrod, nor even to substantiate the manner of his death. We are, however, searching for some revelation of the text regarding the general temperament of Abraham's brother that would inform the rabbinic reconstruction of this event. Because we have no other information about Haran in the text, we have to go to the next best source, his son Lot. Right now, already you can understand that what you imagine, you know, Rav Echelon is doing in a moment like this is sort of asking the questions and saying, okay, what could we learn about Haran? We don't know a lot about Haran. Let's see what else we can find. And then if you find something convincing, you can sort of build it back. So we go to Lot. As we find throughout the Abrahamic narratives, Lot is someone who always took the easy path and the most convenient road, even if it deleteriously affected his family. When Abraham and Lot needed to separate, Abraham offered Lot his choice. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will take the left, meaning that they will divide up the mountain range between north, left, and south, right. Abraham abjured Lot to remain in the mountains, a place of greater faith and solitude. Instead, Lot chose the easy life of Sodom, which at the time appeared as the garden of the Lord, the land of Egypt, lush and fertile. When fleeing from that selfsame city, he begs the angels to allow him to stay nearby as he cannot go further. This leads to the shameful scene in which his daughters get him drunk and become pregnant. We don't know a lot about Haran, but his son bears the shameful badge of an opportunist. Hence, the first child to predecease his father, aside from murder, dies as a result of that opportunistic attitude when applied to the great faith of Abraham. So again, a drawing a connection which is not explicit, sort of saying what we know about the story of Lot, choosing the easy life, this opportunistic approach. Maybe we can, if in the absence, say it this way, in the absence of other information, can we build something off of this piece of information when we already have the Midrash in front of us to suggest that this is what's behind the rabbis viewing Haran this way and building that into the story. Instead of viewing Midrashic literature as separate from the canonized text, by seeing it as a type of parshanut exegesis, we can see the great sensitivity with which the giants on whose shoulders we stand looked between the lines of the sanctified text. So we saw here again the Midrash. First, we had an opening discussion about what is Midrash, the difference between Midrash Halacha, which is more tightly governed, and Midrash Agadah, which is very loose and broad. The idea that that's led to a lot of dismissal or not taking seriously Midrash Agadah, and the argument that as a diverse body, it's hard to analyze in a straightforward way because it has so many different forms. Indeed, different forms are meant to be identified differently and analyzed differently. But that, at their core, there is close reading of text that underlies Midrashei Agadah in many circumstances. And rather than, when something appears fanciful or ungrounded, rather than just say, it's a received tradition, or it's there to prove a point, we want to ask the question, what might it have been reading into the text indeed, and do that process. And we saw that kind of play out in 6 different instances, attempting to argue the plausibility or the grounding of the story of Abraham in his father's idol shop and Abraham in the fiery furnace. Questions, comments, thoughts on this essay? Lance, go for it.
Okay, I read Pascal's Bet as a satirical attack on religion. I read Haran's Choice as a satirical attack on religion. I think that um, what's going on here should be through the lens of Professor Daniel Boyarin, who's Israeli. And you familiar with him?
Yes.
Okay. And his thesis, or one of his main theses, is that the Talmud can be read exactly as you guys always do, or it can be read as a satirical attack on rabbinic Judaism. And also, but I don't agree with him on this one, but he is one of the advocates of diasporism. You know what diasporism is?
Uh,
Diasporism says that Jews will be better off in the diaspora without the state of Israel. So there are many different ways of looking at all these things. And it seems to me that I do the same thing. I mean, you make an interpretation, and of course, according to Claude Lévi-Strauss, every interpretation of a myth is part of that myth. So all these things are part of the Torah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
There's a story of it's Ira
Yep.
of Nechama Leibowitz used to teach soldiers the Parshanut HaMikra. So she tells them to bring your Tanakh with you to the next class, and she says, "What do we know about Abraham?" And they all talk about the midrash with the idols. She says, "Open your Tanakh and find me where it's written." And they're looking back and forth, back and forth. They can't find it. She says, "You won't find it because it's not in the Tanakh. It's a midrash." It just shows you how powerful that midrash is.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I do think it's probably in the top 5 most confused, with appearing in the biblical text itself. Yeah, and it speaks to how compelling and convincing it is, I think, at one level. Yeah. Leela, go ahead.
Okay, so it's just, am I understanding correctly that it's sort of really like literary criticism, and we're just looking at this text and we're taking pieces of language and we're setting them in a schema to try and draw a meta meaning from the text?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I really do think that's what's happening here. Absolutely. Yeah. Great. Yeah, Moshe.
Basically, midrash means commentary.
What's that?
Basically, midrash means commentary.
Yeah, midrash means kind of homiletical expounding. That's I don't know if that's a good translation, but the term doresh means to sort of seek out. So it's the product of the experience of seeking, I guess, is kind of the the way I would describe it etymologically. And commonly, I think homiletical interpretation or exegesis. Well, exegesis really more is parshanut. Homiletical interpretation. I don't know. It's hard to get quite a good English term to get it exactly, to capture it exactly, because of how many versions or variations it contains.
So it's more like an explanation.
Yeah, yeah.
Do
Joan?
other faith traditions do this kind of weaving of all these tales? Are you or do they stick more to the text?
That's a great question. I mean, I truly don't have a sense of other faith traditions, and how they interpret or what surrounds their texts. My very limited sense of Islamic tradition is that there is a kind of an analogous written text and oral tradition and a interpretive tradition around that surrounds the written word. but that's just a very vague sense. Yeah. Yeah. Back to Leela for another comment.
But I can't understand how this way of learning relates to our life. I mean, it's interesting. I'm struggling with this.
Yeah. Great. When you say this way of learning, do you mean the analysis of where the Midrash gets its ideas from, or do you mean the Midrash's content itself? If that makes sense.
Well, everything we've done today, I've followed, I think, but I'm going to go home and I'm going to be like, well, okay, great. What, now what? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude.
Yes.
I can't say it a different way.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a wonderful question. I think it's the question that Rav Avi would typically ask at the end of any class, like what do we take from here? So I think I'll say just a few initial thoughts, and I'm grateful for the question. I think, this book that we are studying for Bereshit, reading between the lines, is aiming to teach us methodological tools for study, where the goal is to understand our tradition better, to understand, where does this midrash come from, and in what basis does it ground its, its own story, I guess I would say. The next level, I guess, which is, okay, we have the text of the Torah, we have the midrash. What is the midrash's goal? So I'm gonna actually share my screen again for a minute, to go back to the beginning, in which, in discussing Midrash Agadah, and its different styles or purposes. One of them was to identify which interpretations are exegetical as an attempt to discern the straightforward meaning of the text, which are others and others. So, at some sense, it's not. I don't think the midrash we studied tonight is claiming or are arguing to be exactly pshat, to really be saying what the plain sense of the text is saying, but I do think it's aiming to sort of continue in the filling in the gaps project, which is to help us understand the character of Avraham by taking the texts and ideas that we already have and using them to develop. And then we ask the second question, okay, well, what do I take away from knowing more about Avraham? And there I would say, I think a lot of our tradition argues that the purpose of the book of Breshit is to set up these relatable, that's how I win. Some people would say it, others would say not, others would say unrelatable, but I would say relatable role models. And so now we look at this midrash and we say, it's not just fanciful, it's drawing off of things we know about who Abraham is to paint a bigger picture of who he is. And armed with that bigger picture of who he is, we now walk out into the world and say, how do I act like Abraham in the world? And or are there ways in which I don't want to act like Abraham in the world? When I read the Midrash, one of the things that stands out to me in my lens is, he made that first customer leave the store in shame. Now, I don't think that bothered the rabbis because they wanted to shame idolaters. I think. I would take it and say, could I help someone who I think was gripped in if what I really believed was a false narrative? Could I hold up a mirror to them to help them see it without shaming them? I guess is like the way I would read the Abraham story through my own sense of things. And so I think a midrash like this, the two levels are first teaching us the methodology of how to see that it's truly grounded in the surrounding biblical texts, and then to use it as an additional text which builds out the characters who are our role models to help us think about how to live their stories out in the real world. Great, great. Lance, last word.
Okay. Isn't Abraham's furnace exactly the same furnace as Daniel's.
Is it?
I think it is. I think somebody dies in Daniel's furnace also, doesn't it? And Daniel is, he goes in this furnace and basically,
Daniel.
yeah, Daniel is saved by God,
Yeah.
just as Abraham is. But
Yes.
there's also somebody who's not Israelite or not Jewish who goes into the furnace and dies, just like Aaron.
But that's stated in the text. It's not a midrash.
Right, exactly. That's in the book of Daniel, right? And that
But
and
I'm making a connection.
yes,
And
it's
for
a great
me,
connection.
the connection is a hierophany. In other
Yes.
words, it's a sign and wonder of God, the connection, the two
Yes.
furnaces.
Yes.
Whether it's in A or B, for me, isn't the question.
Yep. Yep.
I just made it.
Yep. Great. Great.
All right.
All right. Lots to digest, and looking
night.
forward to continuing next week. Love to mom and dad, and take care, everybody. Good night. Good night.